Okay, how do we think about types of stocks to invest in? The traditional way to think about stock categories or stock types is to look at it in terms of sector. So you would have, say, the banking sector, you'd have consumer products, you would have industrials, you might have pharmaceuticals, utilities, technology. Each of these companies, each of these sectors represents a portion of the economy, and typically sectors are not perfectly correlated to each other. So a well-balanced, well-diversified portfolio would have selections from each of these industry sectors. This is one way and sort of the standard way to think about types of stocks. And you want to pick the different sectors and have a representative investment from each of them. But there's other ways to think about types of stocks, and another way is to look at them in terms of risk. Say like a beginning, an exploratory pharmaceutical company that maybe has one drug. That would be very, very high risk. Or a high volatility technology stock. This would be examples of very high risk companies that you'd invest maybe a small amount of capital with potential for large upside or a potential for a zero. But you also might think of stocks that are more stable, say like Coca-Cola, pays a consistent dividend, doesn't grow that much. If the economy grinds to a halt, most likely they're going to sell the same amount of beverages, so it doesn't have a lot of exposure to economic downturns. This would be more of a stable, low-risk type of stock. And so you may want to have participation in different genres of stocks looking in terms of risk. Another way to think about stock types are investment style. So there's growth investing. So say a company that's growing their revenues year over year. There's an idea that these kinds of stocks perform well. But then there's value investing. So maybe a company that is undervalued relative to its book value or has a very low PE. And if you look across investors, typically they will break themselves out into style buckets. And you may want to have representative investments that meet these two types of stylistic approaches to investing. A fourth way to think about investment stock types is to think in terms of time horizon. Sometimes you have maybe a theme that you're looking to invest in or some catalyst that will happen in the near term. And once the catalyst happens or doesn't happen, you liquidate the investment. So maybe this would be a time horizon of, say, a year, something like this, or even less. But then again, I have investments that I think of as forever stocks. For example, I own JP Morgan. I've owned it for 20 years. I'll probably own it for the next 20 years. Some companies are simply, they're foundational and you're comfortable owning them for extremely long time periods. This is another way to sort of group stocks. And then finally, the fifth way that I think about it is to think in terms of theme. So for example, maybe you have a sector of your investing that is thematically designed to protect you for some risk. Say, one of the fears people are worried about is inflation risk right now. So many people are worried about that it's probably not time to worry about it. We'll get to that in a minute. But let's say you want to have some sort of protection from inflation. You might try to find companies that would represent, say, exposure to a commodity, like a gold mining company or a copper mining company, or some company that has extraordinary pricing power. Traditionally, tobacco companies were thought of as excellent inflation protection investments because they could raise price every year and it didn't affect the demand for cigarettes at all. So this is a thematic way to think about investing. You want to have some concern or some trend that's happening and you want to invest accordingly. Maybe the environmental movement or electric cars or wind farms. There are different ways to invest in these types of themes as well. So it's just another sort of style or approach to categorizing the investments you make. And then finally, it's sort of interesting, you can have unusual intersections between these different buckets of types of stocks. For example, Bristol Myers is kind of an interesting example of a relatively stodgy, stable pharmaceutical company. It's been around for a long time. They pay a pretty generous dividend, but at the same time, it's also a play on an interesting theme of a number of new cancer therapies, immuno-oncology. And so this is sort of an interesting stock that sits in a couple of different buckets which might make it interesting or not, depending on your personal opinion and personal thought about this theme and the company itself. And then finally, in the next video, I'm going to talk about how to avoid being the last person hearing about an investment theme or hearing about an investment story behind a given stock. Try not to be the last guy on the boat. Thanks for watching.